Prime Minister, here. Iren, okay. Yeah, Prime Minister, you can go.
Test, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, please give me a minute to set my timer, and my POI preference is through chat. Okay. Panels, we have listened so many news about Trump's reputations, about Trump's actions that make his reputation and his party, his Republican Party, that become controversial and not become popular. And also, based off what their actions, it strengthen the perspective of their supporters and also the populism, that they believe that the Republican Party is not a party that should be followed, and they have to prefer a Democratic party. As a Republican Party, we think that is become our urgency to increase our reputation and also bargaining position, so we can take the power back and also the populism for the society, right? So that's why it's clear for us to assist voter suppression by campaigning and also pulling efforts of voter suppression, such as stricter regulation and so on and so forth, right? Because our goal as a is to make our party become still can keep maintain the electability in the next U.S. election, and also gain a good reputation in the society, right? So I have 2 points of justification here. The first one is why bargaining position in Republican Party it's very important and it's in line with our interests. And second, why cis voter suppression is an effective tool for Republicans to increase their electability and how it works, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, going to my first justification, bargaining position in the Republican Party, right? So we have seen our status quo that why our Trump controversial things that bring a bad image to the Republican Party itself, that people see as example like storm the Capitol and riot to the U.S. Capitol, that give bad image reputation to the society. So it degrades the electability in the society and also can and also in the next U.S. election, right? Okay, so because of that, society thinks that they prefer to Democratic Party because their idea is become more populism and also become leftist. As we can see that people are more prefer to leftist idea that are being promoted by Democratic Party because and also because the Republican Party has done many controversial things like we see, right? That's why in order to back that, to overcome that, to maintain their electability and also their power, we have to know them, understand what is their interest and also their goal as a society. We have to follow them and understand and use political strategy to increase the to take back the popularity and also electability in the end of the day, right? That's why it's very important for to us to follow society interest that can bring this our Republican Party have a chance again to compete with Democratic Party in the US election in the end of the day, right? In that's why it's based on our I'm sorry, it's based on our interest as a Republican Party that we would have uh, a, a popularity again, that we can promote our ideas to the society based on their interest and can have a bargaining position in the next U.S. election, right? Okay, the second justification why cis voter suppression is an effective tool for Republican Party and how it works, right? Okay, so as we can see that voter suppressions like validation of voters, stricter voting regulations, etc., it's backlash to democracy. Here's why: because we limit certain groups' accessibility to have to have to have election to participate in election, right? And also, but in democracy, it taught us that everyone has a chance to access in and participate in elections, right? So that's why democracy so push us to have to get to force everyone to have same accessibility. And also, no, thank you. And that's why in here that as we can see in our society as being progressive, that our majority supports democracy and freedom. Example, as we can see that many people are campaigning about equality, about democracy and freedom because yeah, they are being progressive, right? And also that's why it's very important for Republicans to pay attention to their interests and by cease voter suppression, right? By it means that if they pull our efforts from about voter suppressions, it means that they care for them and especially they care for certain groups that maybe doesn't have access in democracy and make sure that all people have same accessibility, right? This is in line with democracy as a society interest in this progressive in this progressive era. No, thank you. This why from this thing is very important for the Republican Party to understand their interest that supports democracy in the end of the day, right? So that's why within understand their interest in the interest about democracy and also how they can have accessibility in in the next U.S. election, right? If the Republican Party do this kind of effort, it will slowly works to change society perception about Republican Party, right? From being pessimistic and from being criticism or being from have a bad image, bad reputation towards a Republican Party, but in the end of the day, it will decrease because Republican Party have and understand and also gain their interest by using this democracy, using and supports democracy for the society in the end of the day, right? So that's why we believe that is a cease voter suppression that supports the every people to have election is an effective tool for Republican and Republican in the next U.S. election in the end of the day, right? So based on these two justification, that's why it's become an urgency for the Republican Party to cease all efforts of voter suppression in next U.S. election. Proud to propose.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. I call upon Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hi, if there's any POI, just unmute yourself, but please do not barrage me with numerous amount of POI. It will, disrupt me. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2. Wait, sorry. Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that both government. All right. Restarting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that both government and opposition need to agree that the next elections is actually very important, right? I think that this is the turning point for Republican to actually seize control over the U.S. politics yet again, especially within the context in which that the Senate and the House of Representative has been dominated by the Democrats. I think that we need to utilize every means possible to gain foothold and stronghold within this kind of politics in the first place. I think that the interest for Republican Party to win in the next US elections is something that both of the teams should agree. But I think that the burden of government was never only to tell you why this is principally wrong, but also to tell you why inherently this is not within the interest of the Republican Party. I see there's no analysis as to why simply conducting these voter suppressions are going to harm the Republican Party. I do not necessarily understand why their cases should stand, right? I'm going to provide you with only one contribution, pretty much why this is the way this has been proven successful. And I think that as a good pragmatic politician. If it ain't broke, then we do not fix it. But before that, several setup, because I think that opening government never explained to you what does it mean for voter suppression as well. How do we envision these voter suppressions in the sides of opposition? This means that we are going to encourage specific groups, such as people leaning towards the Democrats, to not vote in the next election. This means telling them that their votes does not matter and exists not possibilities for you to actually change the current status quo. If you are a minority, you're still going to be discriminated in the future. If you are, thanks. Everything is hopeless, therefore you cannot change something. Your one vote does not change anything. But second, by telling them that false information as to where will the elections be conducted or when the elections will be conducted, right? In a sense that we are going to provide them with this kind of misinformation to confuse them as to when they can actually submit their ballot. I think that we usually conduct this through the platform of social media by recommending news or opinion that shape their way to thinking to give up on voting or to present them with this kind of news to begin with. Social media is a very strong tool. But second, I'm going to be very charitable towards what the OG told you. 2 points. Number one, they told you that Republican Party need to follow the people interest. Panel, notice I refuse to accept this premise because government never explained to you at all why simply ceasing voter suppression immediately increased the people interest to vote for Republican Party. This is a burden that they never willing to explain. They need to explain this to stand on the debate. But second, they told you that it will backlash the principle of democracy. Number one, we do not restrict the people to have votes. The inherent rights for these people to vote still exist. Because at the end of the day, the decision for them to actually vote or no is still within their own control. I think that the essence of democracy can only be violated in the event that we completely deny them to vote at all, which is completely untrue. We only provide them with this kind of information to influence their decision. I think that this has always happened for when the politicians try to influence a certain individual's decision. But second, I do not unnecessarily understand why the sanctity of democracy is within the interest of Republican Party. Because panel, I think that US politics has consistently straying away from the ideal forms of democracy. Many politicians decide to pursue their self-interest instead of representing the people interest. They decide to abandon all of that and they proceed to self-proclaim and get enormous amount of benefits. They try to gain lobby from a lot of corporations in order to pursue their own self-interest, gain profit, do not care about the government, representing the interests of the corporation instead of the people. I do not necessarily understand why sanctity of democracy, number one, is relevant in this debate, but second, is relevant to the entire Republican Party as a whole. It is an actor motion. Every argument should be linked back towards the interests of the actors. I'm going to provide you to now then to my own argument. Why it has been proven to be successful. First, we must understand why is this effective? Why this entire voter suppressions is in fact effective? Because the message contained within the voter suppressions are very subtle. In a way, we do not directly tell them that you should not vote in our capacity as a Republican politician. We tell them not to vote through media or platform that they have attachment into. People usually do not notice this, even after realizing this voter suppression strategy, because most of these tactics were utilized through social media. This means that we're going to present advertisement that were presented towards the target voters, news that are going to insert it into their own main website, news that are going to be spread across by the people that they trust the most in WhatsApp groups, etc. Right? These are going to reduce their probability to vote in the very first place. Why is this effective? Because in order for you to change someone's minds to not vote in this era of democracy, you cannot directly telling them not to do that. You must subtly tell them. Why? Because telling them not to vote subtly will give the impression that this choice was in fact a choice that they made themselves. They had been scrolling the internet, reading several articles and posts. This grants the voter a sense of power because they think that they already made an informed consent, that the entire decision for them to not vote was in fact their entire decision, not influenced by any politician that wish to insert their values towards them. Comparatively, I think that we cannot simply tell millions of people that you should not vote because they will not believe in us or even bother to engage with us because they already antagonize the conservative politician to begin with, right? This is the reasons why we want to suppress their vote. Very less likely for the opposition, for your opposition to even understand your points, especially because the context of polarization that exists in America are so deep. But before I continue, any PR from closing? Opening? Great. All right, so then let's do several amount of preemptive because I do not have other things to say. Government cannot simply say that this will backlash the Republican Party because then people will condemn the entire actions of the Republican Party, which I think that this is something that closing government are going to bring. Now, first responses, I think that politics has always been cruel. It always pushing the other people in order to a certain group winning. Exists almost no moral legitimacy within every actions in politics. But second away, even if, for example, some people suddenly found out about these voter suppressions and they're taking actions towards that, we as the Republican Party can hide away behind the veil of social media. Because if someone point out that voter suppressions exist, we as the Republican Party can simply blame the social media such as Facebook or Google. Because why the hell would you allow such posts to be made? Why would you allow the algorithm to be presented in a way that it will construct the people's mind to not vote in the very first place? Notice that the entire message within the social media are within the jurisdiction of Facebook and the Google. I think that we can simply blame them at the end of the day. Ultimately, panel, we close thousands or even millions of people that might vote for Democrats. This is relevant because in the next elections, we are going to have a very hard vote and we need every means possible to actually help us. Proud to oppose.
Right, thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. I call upon DPM. You're here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, let me start. Let me set up my timer. So, if you want to be me, just unmute yourself and please state from what bench you are, whether you are opening or closing. Okay, so starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, so the reason why we how the background of Republican Party to this voter suppression, both sides is agreed because Republican Party is less appealing towards the nowadays society comparatively towards the opposite party, that is the Democrats. And second, we are in this debate, we are talking the objective of the Republican Party, which one that could bring the Republican Party itself to get let's say the electability to of the society to choose Republican Party in the end of the day towards the next election, right? But I think on how we to take a look on the background of political party to how the how people who are voting for Republican Party to influence the outcome of the electing, but they are saying on how the cheated system of the election and in the end of the day creating the society to be more the supporter of Trump is being radical and they are attacking the US Capitol. I think this kind of thing creating the less of electability of the Republican Party. So that's why in the end of the day, Republican Party image is going to be bad. Going to be bad in the end of the day. So that's why to repair this kind of thing, our side of the house, SOG, we want to kiss this this kind of voter suppression. So that's it. So that. So voter suppression. This is I also want to clarify on how they say this is how this is going to be backlash the democracy, and democracy is not something important to be pursued by the Republican very first place. I think this is important. I think this is something that is supposed to be important, right? Because how this voting the voter suppression is interfere the consent of the voter in the very first place, right? That I think it's not going to be give a best optimal ways for a voter to maximize their consent to choose in the end of the days, right? So that's why that we as the Republican Party have to pursue something that we call as the democracy itself in the very first place, right? But even if in the end of the day what they say on how the Republican Party is obviously they are not likely to be like democracy because they are more likely to go like working with the other corporation, a big company, and so on and so forth. I think even if it's just for show, okay, because we have to also take a sympathy from the society, from the gray area, for them to maintain our electability to them, to not lose trust to them, because we also have the objectivity to survive in our next next election, right? So here is my speech. I would like to explain to you why this is a better strategy for us, rather than the other option. And second, on how this is how it's at the end of the day creating the gap with left wing and leftist society, and why this is it is harmful. Firstly, why? How this is going to be good strategy for Republican Party in the very first place. We understand what we already told to you on how this Republican Party has already have a very bad image in the very first place since the case of storming U.S. Capitol, right? I think this suppression could be boomerang because a lot of society already labeling the Republican is the party who are like, let's say, I'm sorry, like stupid people who are really conservative and so on and so forth, that they are not a woke society and so on and so forth. But I think how how we are by following the society, what is the actually society wants, and following the majority majority people populism wants, actually is going to be better comparatively. We are choosing the other strategy like voter suppression that actually we already proved, we already say that it's not going to be sympathies towards the society. And second, or how we see on the Democrats choosing the centrist candidate like Joe Biden, or maybe if in the Republican Party we are more likely to choose like Bill Welch to be Senate candidates and so on and so forth. But I think this is going to be lesser electability for the Republican Party because the Republican because if we are choose the centrist candidate from Republican Party, we cannot maintain our idealism, we cannot maintain our value as a conservative party, right? So in the end of the day, we believe that the conservative society will going to be have a less trust like what is already happened under the Democratic Party, right? On how a lot of leftist people who already like start to lose trust with the Biden. So in the end of the day, the society who are supporting the Democrat, or if this is also happen towards the Republican, people will have no will feels that they have no any place for them to be represented inside of the inside of the government, right? So I think it will be represented inside of the government. So I think to maintain this value, this value, and also to repair our image, I think it's better be for the Republican Party to not do kind of this voter suppression to worsen the image of the Republican Party in the very first place. And secondly, I would like to talk about on how the existence of the leftist people inside of the U.S. that how it's going to be create like the gap, how it's going to be wider the gap, and also going to be like less let's say the discussion inside of the society. We think how the Republican Party will like keep influencing or like do whatever what they want, like as the OO said, like utilizing literally like everything just because you need the outcome of the election is good. I think it's going to be like not favorable towards the leftist society. So in the end of the day, how the gap between both how the gap of the discussion between both party is going to be unclear, because both party just saying that both side are like both side is the best. And in the end of the day, this kind of thing is not cannot creating something like check and balances inside of the society. So I think that's why we so proud to propose SOG. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, DPM. I call upon DLO. You're here.
Check, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, cool. For the POI, please just write it in the chat box. I'm going to be standby on my chat box. And before that, okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with the case of team opening government is that they never mechanize how do they achieve their goal. if they want to achieve the idea of the reparations of the image branding of this Republican Party, they do not necessarily explain to me why then it is only exclusive through the idea of choosing all the efforts of voter suppression in the next US election. I think their failure in analyzing and link their argumentation is because they are very lack of mechanization and also characterization about how the U.S. demography is currently existing in the status quo, and how is the interaction of U.S. political party in the current status quo, right? So I think that if you are able to prove to you why then the idea of reparation of the image branding of Republican Party can be achieved through other means, or even making the case of team opening opposition to be the prerequisite of them achieving their goal, I think that we are going to take this debate. Because what in opening opposition believes is that in order for you, for example, to repair your image to the public, is not by, for example, is not necessarily by cheesing all the efforts of voter suppression in the next year's election, because it will not do you any good. The way you repair the failures of Donald Trump's, for example, is when you are able to become the dominating party in the parliament, for example, making a certain policy that is better and can able to create the reparation towards the failures that has been created by Donald Trump, for example, right? So in order for you to create reparation and also making a better policy under your side of the house, you need to be able to sit as a dominating party in the parliament first. And I think the way for you to do that, if you are able to win in the future next election, and I think that this is the reason why we do not want to cheese all the efforts of voter suppression. I'm going to tell you why then in the current status quo, this voter suppression mechanism is indeed necessary for Republican Party. So this is the reason why, as an extension speaker, I'm going to bring you two things. Number one, I'm going to frame the debate, why then it is very necessary for us for not cheesing all efforts of voter suppression. But number two, I'm going to talk about 2020 elections and why cheesing the voter suppression is not the best alternative for us to triumph in the future election, right? So moving on to the first thing, I want to give you
Yo, I closing.
I'm going to give you certain firms on the chat. A fair election is a social construct, ladies and gentlemen. In many instances, especially in the US politics, no election has passed without rumors that it's been rigged by the opposition. This is why a fair and ideal election is really based on which lenses do you see the election, in whose perspective do you see the election. The opposition or the losing party will always believe that the election in certain degrees are not fair. Even in a country with a mature democracy such as the United States, in which becoming one of the oldest democracies exists, democracy still has its flaws. Therefore, the goal of team opening government and also the entire bench of government saying that they want to achieve a condition in which people finally witness a fair and ideal form of democracy is the burden that killed their own cases. They need to prove two things. Number one, why then, even after the Trump has shamefully lost in 2020 election, as states like Wisconsin, for example, Michigan and Georgia flip into Democrats, why it is within the interest of the Republican Party to want to uphold a fair and ideal form of democracy. But number two, why then, in the even where democracies are being glorified for its woke and progressive values, why do you think it is strategic for a political move for Republican Party to chase voter suppressions at the end of the day, knowing the fact that this might only their only chance to win the future election, right? I think that without them proving this, none of the government will shall win this debate, right? So let's talk about 2020 election. Back in 2020 elections, many states like Georgia and Michigan, who previously red, now turning into blue. I think there are two pushing factors as to why this is possible. There are two faults. Number one, because Trump, representing the Republicans, might do a lot of fucked up shits, immigration's ban, building walls, travel ban, and so on and so forth, right? But number two, because the values upheld by the opposition, such as Democrats, for example, has a more universal, viable values of progressivity. We are talking about the generalization of liberals who cater to the needs of the minority because they are more woke towards minority. They are the one who support universal healthcare and etc., right? This is why in states like Georgia, for example, in which African American is a large population, the values of Democrats Party is more viable. Please keep this framing as I will come back there, right? But second thing I want to contextualize is the reaction of media in US politics. The winning of Democrats being successful to flip the red states is being glorified in the media. This glorification and idealization increases the popularity of Democrats because in the moment of time, it's very easy for us to demonize Republicans due to Trump's massive failures, right? What does this tell you? This context necessitates as to why this is not the momentum for Republicans to chase the voter suppression. Why? There are three faults. Number one, one, because the current incumbent majorly seated by the current incumbent majorly seated by the Democrats candidate, like Senate and Parliament. This is why their power to have control over the election will be much bigger in the future, because it means that they have the capacity to take the majority voice to dictate and determine how the future election should be conducted, for instance, allowing the bargaining power of the Republicans to get lesser. But number two, not only that, but in the current status quo, since Republican is no longer the majority seats, this is why we are also going to lose support from non-governmental actors such as companies, making our political support to get lesser in dominating the politics. Actors like company like Coca-Cola and Starbucks or any companies in general would be more likely to side with the incumbent because they understand that the incumbent is the one who have the authority on policy making in the parliament. Siding with the incumbent allow the policy is to be that is passed in the parliament to favor these companies. But last but not least is the characterization of people on the ground. We are currently living in a world where modernization and globalization exist, where woke and progressive individuals dominating discussion in platforms like social media, for example, making the progressive values represented by Democrats to be more viable at the end of the day. These three structural reasons finally give you lights as to why we cannot win without voter suppression mechanism, ladies and gentlemen. With voter suppression mechanism, we're able to put more scrutiny on the demographic of the US politics. That illegitimate immigrants ID card, for example, right, will no longer add any more voices in our current election that might give votes to the Democrats party, for example, right? Analyzing this democracy is the only way that we have. Because in the social media, for example, it is not going to be success as the discussion is filled with woke individuals that most likely to support the Democratic Party values. And we are not able to dominate discussion in the parliament as well, for example, because the dominating party in the parliament, for example, is already dominating the seats at the end of the day. So the only chance for you to at least reducing the gap of Democrats controlling the future election, for example, is through this voter suppression. And I don't see any kind of alternatives that might be available under their side of the house due to this characterization very Protestant and team opening opposition.
Right, thank you, DLO, for that speech. I call upon member of government. Here.
Hi, am I loud and clear?
Yeah.
Wait, okay. We're about to have a Congress election in a year, and it's urgent. There is no time to talk about the sanctity of democracy or social constructs like what opening did. The crux of this debate is fixing our party reputation and securing a win or at least a good image for our next elections. What are the distinct points that CG will bring to you today? First, OG pointed out the problems of the Republican Party correctly, but they don't give you the step-by-step analysis to the solution. If Capitol riots were bad, why is fixing voter suppression the solution? CG will explain a realistic victory and what it looks like, and what are the direct benefits for the Republican Party. We'll do it in a step-by-step analysis. Secondly, OO's argument about voter suppression being successful was a rhetoric without structural analysis. Just because you spend a lot of time saying it'll work doesn't mean it'll work. Like, look at the last election, Trump lost by a landslide, even though he kept on saying that the voting ballots did not work and you shouldn't go there, right? More on my first argument later. I have two arguments in this speech. First, what a Republican victory looks like and how do we achieve that, and two, why we unite a fractured Republican Party. Before that though, let's clear out what a voter suppression means and what each bench needs to defend. Voter suppression consists of mainly two things. First, it is things like bureaucracy and gerrymandering, setting the place of the voting box so that it's hard for Black communities or certain minority communities to access it. Secondly, it is spreading hoaxes that voting boxes are illegal or that the voting boxes will just be thrown away and your votes will not count, right? That is what they will most likely do because this is the most effective one. So because this is a trick using fear mongering and targeting people's deepest instincts of being fooled, then that's what opposition has to defend. It's a really dirty tactic. We want to stop that. What government has to defend is not that we must win the next presidential election. Maybe the next immediate election is fine, like next year's Congress election. like if we win that, that's valuable enough, because that means we can determine what policies that we can pass in the Congress, or even like rule out certain Democrats' policies because of okay, I forgot what that's called, like the 60% thing that can cancel a voting for a policy inside the Congress, right? But even if you don't get that, I'll show to you why we unite the party and why that's valuable. Moving on to my first argument then, all rebuttals will be integrated here, right? In the status quo, Democrats do indeed have the upper hand. They had the landslide victory in the last election. So what we have to do is play safe. Here's why all will not be successful. And here I will also rebut Levi's extension on media, company, and voter support, because those rely on this success too. If I prove this, that extension should just be eaten by a titan. Okay, firstly, the problem with voter suppression is that it's a direct assault to the minority communities. The problem with that is, like, BLM is an all-time high, so if you want to like do injustice to the Black communities and gerrymander, that's going to be a very unpopulist move. That's going to just cause you a lot of backlash, maybe even protests against your literal party and your image, right? That means that it's going to be unpopulist. Secondly, using hoaxes to like make this these voting channels not work, right? The problem with that is that can be easily countered with facts from Democrats. No, thank you. Like the last election, right? Democrats just said that just go to the voting block, your vote still matters, it still counts, and that was all gone, right? But even if you don't buy that, even if that's not a problem, Democrat can also start using voter suppression if it works. And the moment that you do that, because you started the war first, you are seen as the evil one, and moreover, Democrats are already at a huge advantage. That's why, like, you'll just lose out on that battle. Comparatively, how do we win without voter suppression? When you don't have an amazing leader, the way that you win is you make the Democrat leader look bad. That they look like the greater evil. How do you do this? Notice that in the status quo, Democrats are using dirty tactics already. Kamala Harris is a proof of identity politics. You can slander, like, Democrats slandered Trump for the trade war and Middle Eastern conflicts, but at the end, Biden still continued the trade war and still did terrorist bombing in Syria. So therefore, we have to take the moral high ground, right? We have to use clean methods of winning the next election and just exploit the Democratic mistakes. This was how we beat a candidate as good as Obama. We just have to do it again. We just have to take the moral high ground. So that's how we win the next election. But my second argument, even if you don't win the next election, it's important to unite the fractured Republican Party. Notice that in the status quo, Republicans are very divided, right? The problem is, like previously you had solid nationalism during George Bush's era. Being a Republican meant that you are a noble patriot of the country. Now, it's like patriot, but like Republican forwarded a shameful leader that made at least a dozen misleading claims about COVID and about the climate. A president that makes hoaxes all the time and scapegoats other candidates or minorities all the time. A candidate that you still even use after being impeached, right? So the reason that they are divided right now is because of shame. That you are not a patriot, but you are just a Fox News hoax spreader that is worse than libtards. The best way then to reunite the party at that point in this condition is to usually find a new reliable leader, right? But the problem with that is no one is good enough in the status quo. So opposition cannot actually give that in the status quo, right? Because nobody is good enough. And like I would challenge them to give anyone who is like probably even averagely good, but they probably won't be able to do that, right? So what is the way that you like fix this image right now? The way that you fix this is not by adding any more dirty tactics to your report, right? How does government then fix the Republicans' image? You redefine being Republican meaning a patriot. The way that you do this is by using clean tactics in your voter election, right? When you do that, it gives a signaling effect, and you can like actually report that we are not using this method anymore. We are trying to become a patriot. You can signal this through the media, through Fox News, or whatever you want, right? The impact of this is therefore when your voters actually know this, the benefits are twofold. Firstly, you're likely to have a more united voting bloc, which has more campaigns, and you can have new followers, because now you like actually get back, like you wake up that spirit of being a patriot from a Republican, and people are likely to buy into that, and therefore they are more likely to go out to the campaigns because they are actually going out as a prideful candidate and they are not going out to be shamed by Democrats. Secondly, the benefit is that you possibly attract even a good candidate under our side, because the prerequisite of you attracting a good candidate that wants to run the election for you is that you have to have a good report and a good image as the party from the first place, right? Like when Trump entered as a political candidate from the Republican, that was when the Republican had a strong report. So for all of the future benefits of the Republicans and the long-term interests of this party, this is the thing that you have to do first. Fixing the image of the Republican Party is probably the most important thing and the most realistic thing that you can do, given that Democrats are too strong right now. Therefore, this becomes the most important argument in the round. opposition might say that you don't use completely clean tactics because you are still trying to slander Democrats and whatnot. But the point is you use less dirty tactics than opposition, right? And you can still signal that, and you can still use that in your campaigns, and therefore paint yourself as a party that is more moral than the other party, right? Therefore, for the reason that we unite the fractured Republican Party, and the reason that we are more likely, given the step-by-step analysis, to win the election, we propose.
Thank you, member of government. I call upon member of opposition. Here.
Okay. Hold on. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The opening opposition mentioned that creating voter suppression would increase our chances of winning the next US election. The scenario that the closing opposition would like to give you is a situation where even if we don't win the election and instead a new Trump into power, we can still have some compromises and wins in the next election. That is so much better than the alternative provided by the opening opposition. The two pieces of extension from the closing opposition will be one, why we secure legitimacy within the US election, and two, how internal faction within the Republican Party will only increase if we follow the side of the government. Before going into the rest of my speech, I would like to state that I think we went over opening opposition already because it only talks about social media campaigns, which is a very unconvincing mechanism because it is highly unlikely that it will be effective due to the predisposed political mindsets of most people. Additionally, Democratic parties can also have voter mobilization, which will completely neutralize any efforts made by the opening opposition. Therefore, what is the extra mechanism that we will stand for under the closing opposition? We will stand for more extreme things, such as gerrymandering, restricting certain voters from going to the ballot box within our own red states by using government apparatus, etc., because this is the most efficient method of building up the Republican Party. However, some quick rebuttals before integrating all other rebuttals into my speech. The opening government talks about how the creation of voter suppression will increase the bad image of the Republican Party. However, we would like to point out that the image of the Republican Party is going to be bad anyway, no matter what you do. This is because Democrats will always demonize the right wing, and Trump was really bad, and it is impossible to recover from what he did. If the Republican Party is fractured as a result of seizing voter suppression, as we will discuss later, the shattering of the party is a bigger issue than ruining the Republican image by far. Additionally, we would like to deal with certain things that the closing government said, which is what they mentioned about reuniting the Republican Party with the good party, which will be dealt in my second extension. All right, so firstly, going to my first extension, which is why is voter suppression the only way for the Republican Party to secure some legitimacy in the next US election? Before I start this argument, obviously the Republican Party wants to win the next US election, which is obviously the ideal thing to do in this debate. However, this is unlikely for several reasons. Here's the important framing for this argument. There are several things that can be construed under voter suppression, like the restriction of IDs or even using gerrymandering tactics that have historically been done. That means, regardless of whether or not the party does voter suppression, optics or the image of the Republican Party will be seen as the bad party because it is a rising trend in demonization of the right wing. Why? Because Democrats use all tactics to paint the party as bad. There is a rise in Joe Biden's presidency. Note that the next election will probably see Joe Biden be the candidate for the Dems party in a second term, and note that no Republican Party candidate so far has enough legitimacy to counter that of Joe Biden with relatively more experience. There is no distancing from Trump, and even if that happens, that is not going to happen during the next election. Thus, it is more feasible to create voter legitimacy during this next election rather than aiming to win it. So what does this mean for this debate? The most important thing, therefore, is in the debate is to maintain a certain level of voters and assurance within the Republican Party in itself. As aforementioned, the goal of voter suppression is to increase confidence in the Republican Party. If there's a lack of trust and confidence, that will cause internal fracturing, which is dealt with later, and the Republican Party has even less power and likelihood to win any future elections in the long term. Therefore, what is the problem with the government side? Note that the Republican Party is built on a charismatic or a populist stance. That is, they have never had a huge comparative standing historically in terms of their policy. Therefore, we need to maintain a sense of identity politics and victory over other groups, such as racial minorities. If we cannot establish the stance, the Republican Party will basically die out, especially if there isn't a strong sense of camaraderie within the Republican Party in itself. So what is the benefits under the opposition side? Note that voter suppression is very elusive and very unlikely to be prosecuted either socially or legally. One thing that the first speaker has said before is that Trump gave a bad image because the Republican Party has done controversial things. However, we would like to note that the Supreme Court presidents support Republican parties in situations of gerrymandering. Supreme Court has 7 justices, which are 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats, and 1 swing. Historically, these justices have always voted in favor of the respondent, in essence, the Republicans, in cases of gerrymandering. Under the SCOTUS, which is under the legislation, and in a social aspect, gerrymandering is essentially constitutional, and voter restriction is also very easy to get away with. We can following up on this, we can maintain victory in certain red states. Why? Because red states are now dangerously very off on the edge of abstention, because after Trump lost, it showed that the Republican Party is weak to their voters. Therefore, if we create the necessary voter base through voter suppression to maintain in the next elections, we can show them that we can get some representation in the parliament, which will be dealt with again in my second extension. So why is this more important than what the OO tells you? The OO just wants to use advertisement campaigns and the internet to influence voting, which is not effective at all. Very limited people are centrist, and even centrist people will always stick to the status quo, i.e. Republicans not in power and Democrats in power. Why will Democrats suddenly choose not to vote because of just some advertisement campaigns on the internet? We found out that even if we don't gain new voters, at least we don't lose current voters. That is much more salient to gain some, at least some red states in the House of Parliament, Senate, etc. We maintain red states, and even if we lose the swing states, it's okay because we can bring the margin as close as possible and return swing states to red using gerrymandering or other tactics. So in my second session, I will discuss why the cessation of voter suppression is likely to internally fracture the Republican Party and the level of the Senate and in the government. So what is the problem with the arguments brought by the government? So firstly, we need to understand the type of democracy that is run in the United States of America. Senators represent the interests of the people, and they're literally obliged by the government to listen to what their people say. So if the people do not have the will to participate in elections in favor of the Republicans, Republican senators will basically have nothing to represent. The fracturing of the Republicans' quote-unquote motivations will fracture the Senate in itself, especially the power of the Republicans within the Senate. It is especially dangerous because the Senate is already a Republican minority, and fracturing it even more in an internal level will cause even less power to go to Republicans and even less likelihood of us winning future elections. So if you're attempting to protect the image of the Republican Party, you're simply fracturing the Republican Party on a Senate level, which will on the long run ruin the image of the Republican Party anyway. If the image of the Republican Party is going to be ruined no matter what we do, we might as well get some benefits for it by maintaining the Senate and the Republicans' power in the Senate itself. Essentially, it's a domino effect. This is completely likely because the structure of the government mandates the members of the Senate to listen to what their party wants. So if the Republicans are demotivated, Republican senators cannot push for anything because it will be impossible to convince Congress to pass something that isn't wanted expressly by the people. Many Republicans want to maintain a sense of racial dominance within the party because they're conservative, and that is very, very difficult if we do not have power within the Senate. So what's the comparative under the in the opposition proposal? We will essentially ruin the in the government's proposal, they will essentially ruin the Republicans' power in the Congress itself, which is taking large steps backward and especially considering the Republicans are a minority. So because of this, I am so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Right, thank you, member of opposition. I call upon member of government. Here. Member of government, Sumpah. Government whip.
BTW ini sparringnya cek BTW ini sparringnya serius ya Allah. Mungkin kalau mau nggak serius harusnya kita di ruangannya Mbak Astri nggak sih? Okay, so my POI method, just unmute yourself. I don't think I will read the chat during the debate. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. This is how CG can at least got second in this debate. But I think I will prove to you why we got first, right? OO's case is highly contingent towards they can win an election. What kind of election? How do they win? Not clear. If we can prove to you that those winning are most likely to be A, unlikely to happen, or B, will be worse for Republican Party in the long run, I think we can go over OO. And I think we can also go over CO as well. I think we can go over CO as well, especially if CO's case is talking about fracture in the Senate, in the Congress, in the Republican faction in Congress, for example. I think if we can prove to you that the fracture will be much worse if Republicans' optic are keep worsening day by day, that's when we can go over CO. Moving to my first substantive / response toward OO, right? Because OO basic case is like voter suppression is the only method available to us because we need to win and so on and so forth. Funnily enough, it's not. There are lots of other ways that we can do to win. For example, first, the best thing you can do as Republican right now is to restore your optics, is to restore your perception and your image towards your voter base at first. Because right now, the fracture, like what my member has told you, happens on the ground level. That are lots of people that are ashamed of being Republican, that are people who are ashamed of being a Republican by virtue of Republican being constantly demonized, and Democrat keep having enough ammunition, keep having enough issues to be blown up in the social media, in the news, on how shitty and how evil Republican is. I think at that moment in time, the most important thing you do to restore this, to make sure that they want to keep voting for Republican, to make sure that they want to keep supporting Republican in no matter the circumstances they are, is to restore the image. How? At the very least, we are not the greater evil in the grand scheme of things. At the very least, we keep the moral high ground by not doing this. If Democrat wants to do identity politics, if Democrats want to keep any sort of dirty play Democrat wants to have, go ahead, feel free to do it. At the very least, we are not able to be slandered anymore. At the very least, we can slander them back for being hypocrite, for being only capitalizing on black people's vote while giving no structural change whatsoever. But second thing, if they want to play, if say in the next election we do this, if their characterization is true that Democrat is right now is that powerful and so on and so forth, that they, what's stopping them from retaliating, from doing voter suppression in certain swing states that are currently blue, for example, that are much more dangerous for us? The take from here is simple. If we want to play dirty, Democrat can play dirtier and they have more power to do so, which means most likely, even if we can cut certain percent of Democrats voter by making them not voting, Democrat can also cut our voters by making them not voting. Or even much worse, that the one cutting our votes is not Democrat, but another fraction in the party level made by Donald Trump, who wants to make another party, for example, right now, or any other political figures that are currently attacking Republicans. I think the take on this is simple. Most likely, if you do voter suppression, it will not work. It will only harms your vote, for example, on this matter. But third of all, even if, sure, let's say in 2022, we do this and we get some more seats in the House of Representatives, sure. But what's in it for us in the long run? Most likely we will be slandered. Most likely we will be deemed illegitimate. Our seats will be deemed as not worthy of there. The harm of this is tangible. It's simple. For example, in Trump impeachment, there are several Republicans that betrays Republican Party and vote for yes in Trump impeachment. These are the examples, the real examples of tangible manifestation of Republican bringing shame towards their own candidates, towards their own representatives, towards their own Congress members. These are the kind of fractures that will be much more dangerous under CO, because at that moment, if we want to maintain power, what we need to maintain is our voter bloc, is our voting bloc. We do not want people, just because of them protecting their own optics, their own image in the society, betraying Republican. I think that is much more dangerous. In the sense, in a sense, Jen has proven to you that it's enough for us to win. At the very least, take a steady step first. If we are talking about 2022 House election, it's enough for us to like win. At the very least, maintain our voter base now and send 50 people in the Senate. And at the very least, we have Democrat cannot have the super majority, cannot have the 2/3 of the vote, and we can have our voice heard there. But that's enough winning for us. That is achievable even without voter suppression. Voter suppression will only bring bad ledgers, will only bring more bad records in our ledgers, which creates more shame, which create more fraction in party level, in society level, which will be dangerous for Republicans in the long run. For all of those reasons, we beg you to oppose.
Right, thank you, Government Whip. I call upon Opposition Whip to end this debate. Here.
Right, am I audible to everyone?
You're audible to me.
Okay. Okay. I'll take X Venus. I'll take POIs through the just unmute. I might take one, I might not. Starting in 3, 2. Literally, the rest of the debate is about optics. Closing opposition is the only one that tells you what is the goal of this debate and what should the goal of the Republican Party actually be. Because realistically, you're not going to get any gray area voters simply because like a lot of those are going to see Democrats as the humane party. I think a lot of people vote based on historical context, meaning that a lot of Trump's past reparations or like Trump's bad policies are likely still going to be tainted in the future. And that means the most salient issue, the most short-termist issue, and the most easiest benefit that we can get from the Republican Party is where we actually maintain a sense of nationalism, a sense of like victory over certain groups, and a way that we can maintain the red states in a way that no other team in this debate has actually pointed to you. I wanted to say that this was a closing debate. Realistically, I think that CG was very flippant in responding to our case. Like I probably think that O can still take over like CG in this case. 3 points of framing before I go on into 3 issues. The first quickly on image, second on better electability, and thirdly on internal fraction within the party. 3 points of framing. The first is that this thing about like reputation, right? I think the thing about campaigns and whether or not you can actually market these clean things in your campaign is a very weak mechanism. You only have epistemic access towards your own voter base and not the voter base of Democratic parties. Because for example, you only have their contact numbers or you can only advertise to them. And those people, they don't want to see that, we're patriots and we do clean things, because in their own framing and their own reasoning, they are already patriots. They are patriots when they kick out African Americans. They are patriots when they dominate the political sphere. Therefore, nationalism is showing that you win, or even if you don't win, that the margin should be very close and that the margin can be enough to win in the next elections. Secondly, dealing with this idea that Democrats can still want to use voter suppression. Yes, we agree that Democrats can play dirty and clean wash their image, but exactly because, as Andre tells you, Democrats are in power, they're very it's very easy for them to clean wash their image again. Like if they just have a lot of campaign power, that means that they're able to clean wash their image or still show that they are the lesser evil here. This is literally a concession. That means the entirety of CG's case is very unimpactful, because even if it is true that you want to slander Democrats, the Democrats hold asymmetric power over you. Therefore, given that there is some asymmetric power over you, the thing to do is not to make it even more asymmetrical by not recouping any benefit from having some voter suppression. It's to if you're painted to have voter suppression anyway, because as Natasha points out, there other things can still be misconstrued as voter suppression. That means you still want to get some benefit of that voter suppression, especially as you pointed out, it's very hard to catch legally, and it means that you're still likely to continue in terms of government apparatus, etc. That's already convincing Max to win this debate. Thirdly, many of the Republican Party voters right now are Donald Trump voters, or at least they are right-wing voters, not centrist people who are patriots. I think it was just an assertion on their side. The structural reason here is that before that, there is literally no Republican way because Trump gave the charisma and the populism enough to win, meaning that there's still a majority of voters. And the reason why like Trump lost was because of this impeachment thing and his own personal scandal, not because they didn't like Trump and his own charisma. That is still to say the majority of voters still cater to the type of right-wing things, right? Because they want to still like to scapegoat certain types of minorities, and that is why that is still a voter base that we need to maintain in the Republican Party. With that framing, the entirety of the debate goes to like CO already, but I'm going to be charitable and deal with my clashes. Firstly, on image, like quickly kicking out OO. This is not true for 3 reasons and like 2 reasons as to why it makes them look good, right? The first is that they say themselves that the Republican Party is already bad. Democrats have asymmetrical power to demonize you because you are right wing and because they can look at the past context. 2, anything can be misconstrued as voter suppression, even though you don't actually do it. Like there will be some instances where minority groups will not have access to a certain voting ballot box, not because the Republican Party did it, but maybe because it was their own fault, but that can still be used and weaponized by the Democratic Party. Therefore, that harm is symmetric. At least on our side, we actually get the benefit of stopping some people. Democrats have far more popularity right now, meaning that they can maintain that popularity. Even though you get an increase of image, however, we pointed out that this was not necessarily good. Because as OC points out, they want to attack the gray area people and get them. But the gray area people is very easily swayed to Democrats because they are seen as the most humane party. Why? Because comparatively, Republican parties have worse off policies and they don't win on like diverse policy basis, guys. Therefore, both sides has bad image relatively to some extent. We can see that OG might get some sympathy, but no level of sympathy is going to mobilize them to vote for you, especially if it is seen as shameful as they themselves point out. Next thing I wanted to deal with, right, is like why this is true. Because his like people not only sometimes vote on what the current image looks like, they also vote on past historical context, meaning that delinking that is an extremely hard process. At least under our side, you might want to do it when you're already in power and have voter suppression, so you can maintain some form of recouping your losses when you want to delink to Trump, but definitely not now in the next US election. Dealing with CG then, on like this idea of slandering Joe Biden, 2 reasons why this can't work. The first is that Joe Biden is seen, like can be seen as neoliberal, but Joe Biden is also repairing much of Trump's policy. So even if the trade war continues, there is still a benefit to Joe Biden of repairing Trump's policy, and that is still a comparative advantage, and that neutralizes out the fact that he's still continuing the trade war or bombing Syria or whatever. 2, people don't vote on present things but past associations. That's why Democratic African Americans rarely shift, because their families often also vote on that past nostalgia, etc. Even if you buy that analysis of slandering Joe Biden, we can do that too. Because as you pointed out, if both parties are equally bad and you can demonize the left wing strategically, that is where you are able to get some like better image under our side of the house. Second idea then on electability. CG says that this is a direct assault to minority communities and this is unpopulist with the rise of BLM. Okay, the Republican Party voter base is not BLM, okay? That kicks out that argument. The second more relevant claim here is that we are able to attract a good candidate, that is like when you have a good reputation as the Republican Party. However, this candidate, right, is likely not going to want to go to a losing party, because that means like if that person dedicates their entire life into democracy, that means that they're likely going to lose out on some benefits of not having some maintaining of power. Therefore, a good candidate and like experienced candidate is likely to be attracted by a party that is succeeding, or in a red state where there is some form of control and government power, where that good candidate can already see some immediate benefit to themselves. That is where you get better candidates on our side, and you can have that in the long run. Thirdly, and really quickly on fracturing the Democratic Party, Government Whip literally doesn't talk about this at all. He made the entire analysis predicated about winning votes. However, we told you that this is not because people want to look patriotic. Many senators want to have racial dominance, and the reason why, the structural reason why here, is because they're used to it. Because in the past, their Senate is already majority white, for example, in the Republican Party, and they want to maintain this like thing, right? Secondly, even if there's a fraction like never Trump Republicans, they are much easier and like much more empowered under their side when they can also slander the Republican Party. Comparatively, we told you that if you want to maintain a sense of racial dominance, you only get it under their side. We are the one that makes the Republican Party stronger. Very, very proud to oppose.
Right, thank you for the debate. Please wait for a while I formulate my decision.
So thank you for the debate. This was an interesting debate. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump into my OA, and my OA will be divided into two parts. Number one, the decision, and number two, the reasoning behind this particular decision. So I think this was, so number one, decision. I think that this was a closing debate with rankings going as follows. The first going to closing opposition, second to closing government, third to opening opposition, and fourth, unfortunately, goes to opening government. Okay, so why did I put these themes into these rankings? I want to start with opening government and point out why each team was able to top the materials brought by them. So in general, opening government brought two things. Number one, the principle of democracy, of why voter suppression restricts uh, people's rights to exercise their choice inside of a democracy, and we should oppose voter suppression because of that. I think generally this material, compared to all three themes, was left out of the debate because all three themes, other than opening government, agreed that this debate works on the frame of the interests of the Republican Party. That the Republican Party generally does not care about legitimacy, about democracy in politics. This looks like opening opposition's focus on winning the election. This looks like closing government's ideas about Democrats also playing dirty. This also looks like closing opposition's ideas about Republicans irreparably being associated with these sorts of things, and also about the probability of Democrats being dirty. So in general, I think this principle is like this principle often can be ignored in terms of this debate. And I think necessarily OO in particular was able to point out that US politics in general have been very dirty, in which politicians do not cater to the interests of like the public, but to their specific voter bases, to their donors, etc. So that principle is pretty much left out of the debate. I don't think that this principle is important to the Republican Party. Number two, they talked about the image problem that Republicans have now, with problems like the storming of the Capitol and what Republicans need to restore their image through seizing voter suppression. The problem with this argument in general is that it was not mechanized well. That is, I did not quite understand why seizing voter suppression will then cause like the Republican Party to be forgiven, for example, in storming the Capitol, and what is the specific damage of voter suppression, and what is the specific gain when you cease doing that. I think each team was able to top this material in these ways. Number one, opening opposition was able to top this by positing that the harms regarding image will happen anyway, because elections will be seen as legitimate by the Democrats anyway. That Democrats that the Democratic voters do not just vote based on like we looking nice, but also based on like personal allegiances, like the wokeness, like specific allegiances to minorities, etc. And also after that mitigation, they were able to mechanize a way by which they could restore their image by winning through voter suppression and then passing policies. CG was able to top this by pointing out the specific damages that a policy of voter suppression then gives to the Republican Party. That is, they were able to point out that it is specifically anti-minority, that this specifically turns off like good candidates, that this specifically turns off like candidates that want to play fair, that might have enough legitimacy to challenge Democratic candidates, which I think depicts for me the specific damage of voter suppression and what things that we will specifically get when we take that out, especially when they frame their burden to be lower than opening governments, when they posited that the point isn't to look good, but the point is to look as the lesser evil compared to the Democrats that are also doing their own shitty stuff, right? Closing opposition was able to top this by pointing out that because raising your image is not useful anyway, the main crux of this debate is about increasing the unity of the Republican Party and mechanizes like
the, what sentiments exist inside of the Republican Party and why that sentiment of domination is necessarily in opposition towards seizing voter suppression. So, in general, there were better mechanisms in other sites on how you can get on how you can get images. Moreover, the specific framing of gray area, people in the gray area, was not taken as the most important actor in this debate. So that's why I think opening government got fourth compared to all the other teams. So let's move on to to opening opposition. So I think there were two parts to this, two things that I want to say in this comparison. Number one, I think the crux of their case, which was about the mechanization about winning elections through voter suppression, was unable to be credited above closing, because I think both closings were able to point out that the mechanization through social media was quite unrealistic and quite unreasonable. Specifically, closing government was able to point out that Democrats can also do counter campaigns through social media to like take care of the misinformation, and that they can also spread their own hoaxes, while closing opposition was able to posit that most people vote based on past preferences anyway, and that your social media messages won't necessarily challenge that vote. Thus, because I was not able to credit this specific mechanization, a lot of the argumentations coming from DLO about how you can get more legitimacy when you're elected, about how companies will support you, etc., cannot be credited above closing as well. But regardless, there is still one framing that still stands, even though the mechanization does not stand. This was the framing the Democrats being like democratic voter base necessarily being someone that is not going to change their minds because they're progressive and they care about both things, and that you will still be seen as unfair anyway. You will still be seen as bad. Why is this the case? Then, given that framing still stands, closing debate still tops over OO. Closing government, I think, specifically tops over this by also pointing out mechanisms that aren't just about that aren't just about democratic voters, right? Specifically, they talked about how Republican parties and people inside the Republican Party, especially never Trumpers, can restore like pride in the inside by the pride of like being a member of that party without like being attacked all the time because you're seen as a party that's that oppressive, etc. While closing opposition, I think, was able to top this by then pointing out the logical conclusion of this, that is, because people aren't you're not going to be popular outside of the Republican Party anyway. You're better off like being popular inside of the Republican Party with the explanations that I talked about earlier. So even if this framing stands, there are materials that are, I think, still compelling in closing government, also about like attracting good candidates and closing opposition that compared to opening opposition's lack of material because mechanization doesn't stand, means that closing debate trumps over opening debate. So let's talk about the last comparison in this debate, which is between closing opposition and closing government, and why closing opposition gets first. So I think I want to start this comparison by talking about what both teams agree upon. I think both teams agree upon a minimal conception of victory that you can't necessarily change that many people's minds, that your victory is probably going to be something like winning more seats in parliament in like the House so you can get more voices, or winning through like the filibuster instead of getting a majority inside of the House and the Senate, right? I think this is important because it shifts the focus of the debate mainly towards internal dynamics instead of the Republican Party, as opposed to how the Republican Party can attract voters. But I think I want to talk about image first, and I want to talk about why CO wins slightly in this chat. So the thing about image that closing government posits is mainly that you're able to portray yourself as a lesser evil compared to the Democrats. I think CO was able to respond to this successfully in a few ways. They were able to point out that because the Democrats are in power, it's it is actually the case they're more able to hide these sorts of atrocities, for example, and more able to paint themselves as a good actor. Thus, that this main mechanization of putting yourself as a lesser evil becomes more compelling to me. However, it is true that there will still be some degree of false image under closing opposition, right? Because I think the extent that closing opposition has proven that this will not be that foot switch will not be harmful is that the Supreme Court does approve of this, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the people will approve of this, right? But regardless of the fact that there will still be damages, I'm not sure that that there will be significant benefits in closing government in terms of damages saved in terms of reputation. Thus, the deciding chat of closing debate is about internal politics inside of the Republican Party and how you attract good candidates and how you mend the fracture inside of the party. And I think the main reason why I was able to take closing opposition over closing government is the portrayal of the psychology of Republicans and why most of them are often people that are still right-wing. Most of them are older people that have been habituated to right-wing views and being dominant towards minorities, which means that these people inside of the party are necessarily still going to want you to continue these policies, going to want you to support voter suppression. While comparatively, I think CG was able to point out the existence of never Trump Republicans that are ashamed of these tactics. I think I was not able to credit this over CEO for two reasons. Number one, I think given that CEO has already framed that the extent to which you're able to frame yourself as a lesser evil is not that huge, I'm not sure to what extent can you prevent never Trumpers from hating you and from going against the Republican Party, which is why, secondly, CEO's comparatives then makes more sense. That is, in the case when there is some probability, when it's uncertain that you will fix your image to that extent where never Trumpers won't leave, it is at least better to retain your core, your core of racist white old people. So that's why I think I gave those rankings to those teams. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Aku akan kasih nomor, I think.